being in the YouTube forever. It's very good.
Okay.
So 1 minute, I will start. I will start in Greek. So
Yeah, I understand.
it'll be a bit complicated, but that's okay. Καλησπέρα σε όλες και όλους που για μια ακόμη φορά συνδεθήκατε στη σειρά των μαθημάτων Health and Religion για να ακούσουμε άλλον έναν σημαντικό εισηγητή πάνω στα θέματα αυτά. Σήμερα έχουμε την χαρά και την τιμή να φιλοξενούμε τον καθηγητή Daniel Hall, ο οποίος είναι καθηγητής της χειρουργικής και faculty στο Institute of Bioethics στο Πανεπιστήμιο του Pittsburgh. Είναι ερευνητής και είναι διευθυντής στο πρόγραμμα το εθνικό του Veterans Health Administration. Ο καθηγητής Hall ξεκίνησε την εκπαίδευσή του από το Πανεπιστήμιο του Yale και εκεί στην θεολογική σχολή του Yale πήρε και το Master in Divinity, τελείωσε την ιατρική στο Yale School of Medicine, μετά έκανε μεταπτυχιακές σπουδές στο Duke University και συνέχισε να είναι πια ένας καθηγητής της χειρουργικής, αλλά συγχρόνως ένας φιλόσοφος και θεολόγος. Έχει γίνει και ιερέας στην Επισκοπική Εκκλησία και έτσι με αυτό το διπλό του ρόλο προσφέρει εδώ και πολλά χρόνια στους γιατρούς, τους φοιτητές, τους διαφόρους ενδιαφερόμενους στην πνευματικότητα και στην θρησκευτικότητα. Σήμερα θα μας μιλήσει για ένα θέμα το οποίο είναι ιδιαίτερο για όλους μας, με τίτλο «From Altar to Table, My Journey as a Priest and Surgeon». Από την Αγία Τράπεζα στο χειρουργικό τραπέζι, η πορεία μου ως ιερέα και χειρουργό. Professor Hall, we are very grateful for your participation in this series, and we are looking forward to listen and hear your topic from altar to table, your journey as priest and surgeon. We are all excited and grateful for your presence. So the floor is yours. Thank you again.
Great. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. A few words of it I was able to translate and understand. It's morning here in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and I gather it's afternoon there in Athens, and I hope you're all enjoying a good summer. To begin, I'd like you to ask yourself for a moment how many words it would take to define the concept of beneficence. In doing so, I get two words: do good. Now, by contrast, take a moment and consider how many words you would need to define what it means for a human being to flourish. I'd hazard a guess that your definition of human flourishing required more words, probably a lot more. You see, flourishing, which we get from Aristotle and the Greek, eudaimonia, is what philosophers call a thick concept, compared to the thin concept of beneficence. The advantage of thin concepts is that definitions can be sufficiently precise to secure consensus and agreement. The disadvantage is that they are so thin and abstract that they often lack power to motivate action. By contrast, thick concepts like human flourishing are exceedingly powerful. They are the kinds of things that people are willing to die for, perhaps even kill for. But precisely because they are so thick, it is often difficult to reach consensus on the precise definition. And as passions run high about that definition, we sometimes encounter some of that killing and dying. Whoops, hold on for a second. Why is this? All right. But if we step back for a moment and consider these images, I contend that the majority of you here on this conference line are just like these folks, vital, independent, robust, perfect pictures of the virtues of what it means to be a good American, which of course is independent and autonomous. Pull yourselves up by the bootstraps and seize the dream of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, as 250 years ago Thomas Jefferson memorialized in the Declaration of Independence. By any definition, the folks in these pictures are flourishing. And although life is not always a bed of roses, I suspect that on balance, most everyone in this conference is also flourishing. Now, by way of contrast, I suspect that we could also largely agree that at least in this moment, this man is not flourishing. And yet this is precisely where I work as a surgeon, and I gather many of you also probably work in the intensive care units. And please don't get me wrong, the tubes and the bags and the drips and the machines that make up the modern ICU are incredibly powerful tools. They can and do restore people to the fullness of life, climbing mountains, raising families, and building relationships. And doing so is often nothing short of miraculous. Yet at the same time, I suspect you can each tell a story of a family member or loved one whose body was entrusted to the care of modern medicine, only to discover that somewhere in the course of their care, the technology stopped serving the purposes of the body, and the body started serving the internal purposes of the technology. This tragic reversal of fortune is far too common, at least here in the United States, and that is why it has become the focus of my calling, my discipleship, and my vocation as both surgeon and priest. Indeed, it is the topic that I'm trying to engage today. I want to explore with you what it might mean for medicine, or in my case, surgery, to help people flourish, especially in those circumstances when old age and illness divest them of the independence, autonomy, and vitality that we reflexively associate with human flourishing. To do so, I want to tell you a story of how I came to do what it is that I do, not so much to trumpet my own horn, but to share one example of the unexpected and magnificent way that God's providence works through clay feet and hands like mine and perhaps like yours. And in sharing my story, I hope you will recognize parts of your own story, a story that is no less called to work out God's providence in the specific context in which God has placed you. To steal a phrase of my professor of patristic theology, I am a once-born Christian, born to faithful parents and baptized into the Presbyterian Church by my paternal grandfather in Hastings, Nebraska in 1969. Soon thereafter, we moved to Massachusetts, where the relative rarity of Presbyterians in the land of Congregationalists landed us in the Episcopal Church. But it was an unusually Calvinistic Episcopal Church, populated as it was by the evangelical and Reformed faculty of Gordon College and Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, who found the Episcopalians preferable to the Congregationalist because even if Anglican preaching left something to be desired, as it did in their estimation, the lectionary at least guaranteed that parishioners would encounter 4 passages of unadulterated scripture that even the preacher couldn't screw up. The church was decidedly evangelical when we arrived, with only quarterly communion, But I came of age in the 1980s as the Episcopal Church shifted to weekly Eucharist and more Catholic liturgical style specified by the 1979 Book of Common Prayer. The community in which I grew up was rich and supportive, that shaped me to know that what it meant to love, to praise, and to follow Jesus with body, mind, and soul. And as the hit Netflix original film series Stranger Things, which I hope you've perhaps seen, reminded me, the early 1980s were the time of Radio Shack, walkie-talkies, dirt bikes with banana seats, and basement adventures with Dungeons and Dragons. And that was how, in fact, I rolled as I was growing up. I was, in fact, a nerd, and a motivated and very lucky nerd at that, who got hooked up with a local biotech firm where I learned how to screen for restriction enzymes in bacteria isolated from a local sewage treatment plant. I managed, in fact, to find an enzyme that no one had found before, and that won me the state science fair and eventually admission to a fantastic college. And this was my freshman dorm room, where I arrived planning to pursue hardcore basic science aimed at more enzymes. I also arrived with a very clear plan to put God on the shelf for a little while. It was time to give church a rest. Well, that was a nice try. By November of my freshman year, I sensed that something was not right. And not knowing what else to do, I picked up the prayer book given to me at my confirmation and started reading the catechism. I'm not sure that I'd even read the catechism from start to end, but I sat up all night making notes in the margins regarding my reservations. The next day I planted myself on the doorstep of the poor fool calling himself the Episcopal chaplain, and bless his heart, he engaged my questions and slowly roped me into the community of students there gathered. And it was in that community that I started to claim the faith of my childhood as an adult. I also took a few courses in philosophy and discovered that as cool as it was to understand the molecules that made up the bark of the trees in the forest was also something pretty cool to study. So I created a double major in biology and philosophy, writing a senior essay on the ethics of sequencing the human genome. And in my junior year, out of nowhere, the notion of ordained ministry was pressed on me by a variety of folks, some I knew well and others not so much, who all said, "You're going to be a priest, aren't you?" That took me off guard a little bit, and as exciting as the prospect of ordained ministry appeared, it also seemed strange to turn my back on such obvious and long-standing gifts for understanding and explaining the world in scientific terms. And slowly the advice of mentors sunk in that medicine might be a place where I could study both the bark of the tree and the forest itself, a place where I could use and manipulate science to achieve a broader, more applied purpose. So after testing the idea for a couple of years by teaching biology and chemistry in Zimbabwe as a missionary of the Episcopal Church, I returned back to school to get training in both theology and medicine, front-loading divinity school in my first 2 years and working my way through the ordination process as I finished medical school. And as summarized in this dissertation on this website that you can still find, I discovered during my medical school tenure in some research there that there were more than 100 ordained physicians in the tiny Episcopal Church, and perhaps as many as 700 across the United States of all denominations. And this bivocational approach was far more common than I in fact imagined, although very few people pursued both vocations simultaneously. Most ordained physicians pursued one vocation for approximately 20 years before shifting over to the other vocation. But it was my intention to try to pursue a more integrated approach to bivocational ministry, doing both at the same time. So in June of 1999, everything came together, and I graduated from medical school one weekend, was ordained deacon the following weekend, and the week after that, I started my internship in surgery here in Pittsburgh with this group of 5 other guys. It's been a whirlwind ever since, and I've never really been sure where it would all land, other than I felt persistently called to be at the interface between church and hospital, theology and medicine. And as I wrote in this essay back in 1999, it seemed to me no accident that in so many cultures and times, the medicine man, the shaman, and the priest are the same person. And rather than dispensing technical mastery, the shaman's role was to help people weave the experience of illness into the fabric of their life in some meaningful way. So in an era when even the monks and nuns have shed their habits for contemporary street clothes, it is not coincidental that doctors continue to live in cloistered environments called hospitals, where they wear flowing white vestments and preside over life and death. Physicians, it seems to me, are the de facto clergy of our highly technical and scientific society, right down to the vestigial stethoscope that we continue to wear over our shoulders as a mark of our authority, not unlike the priest's stole. Yet few physicians recognize the liturgy that they have joined. They execute their responsibility as they have been taught, managing the various organ systems to ensure physiological homeostasis, raising the blood pressure when it gets too low, filtering the blood when the kidneys lose ground, or assisting the lungs when they can't keep up. But meaning, value, and ultimate significance? Physicians don't get much training in that. Weaving the experience of illness into the fabric of life? Not really the job description, at least in the pre-medical resources that attract us to the practice. However, it hasn't always been this way. At least in the United States, we have forgotten our history, particularly in medical science. Progress tends to orient us to the future, not the past. And there's really no emphasis on the history of medicine, let alone theology, in pre-medical training. And often we have a very spotty understanding or awareness of history in general. And in this context, it is rare for any contemporary medical student or practitioner to recognize that once, in fact, there was no secular. As John Milbank carefully summarized in his book, secularity only begins to emerge in the West in the 15th century, taking its current form in the 18th century around the same time that the United States declared its independence. And that, to an American at least, is a long time ago. But in the history of the Christian Church, as you Orthodox are deeply aware, it's very recent history. So here's a floor plan of St. Giles Hospital in London in 1117. And it bears mentioning that there were in fact historically no hospitals in ancient Rome. It was not something that the Roman ethic had been able to invent on its own, and it needed the Christian church to establish the institution of hospitals, the word for which actually comes from the monastic virtue of hospitality. And to the extent that monasteries preserved learning and knowledge through the Dark Ages, many of the physicians who practiced at this time were also clergy. And in fact, the arrangement of this hospital, as well as the arrangement of many of the monastic buildings, were arranged in such a way that the hospital for the travelers were at the outer portion of the facilities. The hospital for the poor came inside that, and even closer inside that was the hospital for the sick that was directly opposed here from the chancel, so that those who were recovering from illness or dying would have a clear view into the chancel and the mysteries of the Eucharist. In addition, many of us have forgotten that Niels Stenson, after which the parotid gland duct is named, started life as a Lutheran, became a Roman Catholic priest, and eventually became the Vicar Apostolic of Hanover and the Bishop of Titiapolis. John Wesley, who was an Anglican priest and the founder of Methodism, also happened to be the author of the best-selling medical text called Primitive Physic for much of the 18th and 19th centuries until the modern reformation of medical education in the United States with the Flexer Report. This actually was not unusual because in this period of time, the non-conforming sects of Protestant Christianity that did not want to go with the Anglican Church and fall under the authority of the King of England had to develop some other way to make money, and the seminaries in England during this period of time, in addition to teaching theology, were teaching medicine so that those people could be tent-making ministers and clergy as they went out and could not avail themselves of a formal job paid for by the crown. And currently in contemporary United States, and I suspect also in your neck of the wood, most hospitals were in fact founded by religious communities. Here in Pittsburgh, the big healthcare system is the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, abbreviated UPMC, and we've taken over and renamed UPMC Presbyterian Hospital, UPMC Mercy, which was a Roman Catholic hospital, UPMC St. Margaret, which was an Episcopalian hospital, UPMC Passavant, which was Lutheran, UPMC Montefiore, which was Jewish, and we've actually extended into Italy, and this is my favorite because of its audacity, UPMC Salvator Mundi, which, as you probably recognize, means UPMC Savior of the World, which is, I think, an idolatrous claim. As my training in surgery advanced, I became more independent, and one night during my 4th year of residency, 2 patients came into the trauma bay at the same time, and they both needed surgery immediately, and there were only me and my senior faculty surgeon. The sicker patient went to the operating room with my senior surgeon, and I was left alone with the other patient for the first time as the surgeon of record and responsible for this patient to make that. I had been around the operating room table for hundreds, if not thousands, of cases at that time. This was the first time that I was the responsible person, and stepping up to that table as the responsible person was differently sobering. Now, it turned out that my training was up to the task, and I managed to safely accomplish what needed to be done, and sewed the patient back together again, who did well. But something in me had changed with that experience. And as I was wheeling the patient out of the operating room to the intensive care unit, it dawned on me that this was not the first time that I had stepped up to a table with a renewed sense of responsibility, fear, and trembling after I had been changed. You see, in many ways, the experience was identical to the first time that I stepped to the altar as a newly ordained priest to celebrate my first Eucharist. Both altar and operating room table are tables which bear body and blood. Both tables concern life and death. Both tables require light, though we surgeons are always in want of more candle power. Both tables involve complicated rituals of hand washing. Both tables are draped with special sheets that set it apart as holy and mark the space as extraordinary. And like priests, surgeons put on vestments that not only control contamination, but also mark the space as sacred. And although I had been around, beside, and behind the Christian altar thousands of times as an acolyte or a chorister when I was growing up, or a seminarian over the years of my training in graduate school, it was a completely different experience the first time I was the responsible priest leading the congregation in the mysteries of the Eucharist. And as I continued to attend to people from both the altar and the altar operating room table, these mutually complementary contexts began to shape my understanding of how to live out these callings bivocationally. I came to understand that there was something Promethean about the moral imperatives driving medicine, which Gerald McKinney calls the Baconian project after the 18th century philosopher Francis Bacon. McKinney deconstructs contemporary medical practice to uncover two moral imperatives that drive what we do. The first is to relieve suffering, and the second is to maximize autonomous control over the contingencies of our bodies. Now, there is nothing wrong with either of these goals on their own, but when hooked up to the technological machinery of modernity, it yields an expectation that given enough time, efficient technology will eliminate disease and suffering. But Kenny points out that achieving these ends would functionally relieve the human condition, Because despite what we tell ourselves about our own human agency and independence, at root, what it means to be human is to suffer and not be in control of our bodies. This Baconian project is easily observed in the contemporary press. This is a headline from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette back in 2014 during a political battle over the funding of medical research in the National Institutes of Health. It read, "Give people hope, restore federal funding for medical research." In that article, the dean and vice chancellor of the medical school went on to say, Congress's failure to increase NIH funding is yet another blow to patients and families whose hopes for alleviating their burden of disease and disability are intertwined with groundbreaking biomedical research. I don't think it is coincidental that hope is in fact a theological concept, one of the three theological virtues that Christianity adds to the classical cardinal virtues of antiquity. Unless you think that this is far-fetched and not gaining traction, Ray Kurzweil and others, you see it a lot with the AI folks who are planning to upload their consciousness to the cloud at the singularity, which is just a few moments away when we're going to have enough computing power to essentially eliminate the need for our bodies entirely. In addition, my colleague and fellow ordained physician Jeffrey Bishop came to understand that contemporary medicine was operating medicine is that humans are but molecules in motion. You'll remember in physiology class we learned how the oxygen in membrane in service of aerobic metabolism. The heart pumps blood in the aorta and down through the arteries, arterioles into capillaries before returning to the venous system, back to the heart to circulate that oxygen and carbon dioxide. In pathophysiology, we learn all the ways in which the molecules in motion can start going the wrong way. The heart stops pumping efficiently and fluid builds up in the lungs. The alveolar membranes stop exchanging gas and acid builds up in the blood. So we learn in therapeutics how to get those molecules moving back in the right direction again. We give medicine to make the heart pump harder. We increase the pressure on the ventilator to improve the gas exchange and to alleviate the respiratory acidosis. By this account, unfortunately, reduces the functioning metaphysic of medicine to merely efficient and material causation. It gives no account of what Aristotle calls formal or final causation, which attempts to explain to what end and for what purposes the molecules are in fact moving. And as Jeff Bishop points out, contemporary medicine no longer has even the language to discuss the what for and why beyond why of medicine beyond its own internal logic. So with tongue in cheek, we can summarize the ends of secular medicine as to merely live long and prosper. But by contrast, the ends of Christianity are, among other things, to take up your cross and follow Jesus. The good news of St. Paul's gospel is that faith, love, and hope, these are the theological virtues, these three abide. But the greatest of these is love. Whereas, by contrast, the good news of contemporary medicine is summarized by Tom Beecham, the author of the most influential text of medical ethics, at least in the United States, is as follows. Autonomy, beneficence, and justice, these three abide, but the greatest of these is autonomy. I mean no disrespect to Professor Beecham, and I admit that my playful summary of his philosophical approach is not entirely fair, but I hope that the contrast between these two visions helps crystallize one of the challenges of practicing medicine in our current context. We struggle to remember or articulate with confidence any clear sense of what bodies are for or the purpose that medical health might serve. And this is the primary concern taken up by my colleagues Farr Curlin and Chris Tollefson in their book Attempting to Recover a Functioning Metaphysic for Medicine. They name the current approach as the provider of services model of medicine, in which the patient approaches the physician with problems, and after explaining the options, the patient autonomously selects the desired service which the physician then efficiently provides. They contrast this with a sense of medicine as vocation, a call beyond the self, in which physicians profess a commitment to health, which they define as the well-functioning of the organism as a whole, where health is not an end in itself, but a means to fulfill a specific vocation, be it father, husband, surgeon, friend, or ultimate frisbee player. And to the end that physician clergy explicitly profess two vocations, both medicine and Christian sacramental ministry, it makes visible, perhaps even sacramental, the vocation that all baptized Christians have to live out their vocation as disciples of Jesus, loving God and neighbor with heart, mind, and soul. And if we take seriously the Christian revelation of God as Trinity, one undivided substance in three distinct persons held together through the procession of love, it means that something is off kilter with our definition of health as an isolated, autonomous, individual organism. As farmer philosopher Wendell Berry has noted, it means that health is membership. By this he means that community, in the fullest sense, a place and all of its creatures, is the smallest unit of health, and that to speak of health of an isolated individual is a contradiction of terms. And he goes on to say that in a world of love, things separated by efficiency and specialization strive to come back together, and yet love must confront death and accept it and learn from it. Only in confronting death can earthly love learn its true extent, its immortality. Any definition of health that is not silly must include death. The world of love includes death, suffers it, and triumphs over it. The world of efficiency is defeated by death. At death, all its instruments and procedures stop. Yet the world of love continues, and of this, grief is the proof. So be it the liturgy of presiding over life of death in the hospital in our white coats and stethoscopes draped over our shoulders like stoles, or the liturgy of the operating room table that looks in many ways like the altar of the Eucharist, there is in fact, I think, a profound disconnect between what we as physicians promise in our liturgy and what we deliver in our practice. And I think this disconnect goes a long way in explaining the popular interest in contemporary complementary alternative medicines. It isn't so much that these alternatives are more effective than allopathic medicine. I don't think they are. But they each come with a cosmology attached that helps locate illness and death in an overarching narrative. That the Church and Christian theology seemed comparatively silent in this sphere seemed really odd to me. After all, Christians are the people with the audacity to claim that God himself took on human form. And if Jesus cared enough about the body to make it his own and to redeem it, it seems that Christians should have a lot to say about the care of that body. And living into this interface to recover a Christian vision for medicine is precisely what I've been trying to do, be it in fits and starts. Again, don't get me wrong. The best physicians, religious or secular, have always done something to help people make sense of illness. But the center of gravity has shifted so far that many, if not most, physicians are unaware of this responsibility or unsure of how to fulfill it. We've been taught that the body is a machine and that material forces make the machine move. We've learned how to oil that machine so it moves smoothly. But to what end or purpose it moves is well beyond our training, and as a culture we are skeptical of the tradition, often religious sources of such, that gives us insight into those ends and purposes. So those are some of the current concerns that I felt called to address over my career as a bivocational surgeon priest. But I will tell you it hasn't been easy, and there have been a number of false starts. Perhaps you've heard of John Hofstadter. He had a moment about a decade ago. He was a junior professor at Princeton who came to fame for publishing his so-called curriculum vitae of failure. It was a clever way of making the point that for every success that lands on someone's resume, there are often several blind alleys, strange detours, or outright failures that don't fit the socially accepted narrative of an unbroken linear rise to fame and fortune. So without further ado, let me share with you my CV of failure. From 2002 to 2007, I did a postdoc fellowship at Duke, trying to measure some of the empirical associations between religion and health. I'm sure you've seen reports on some of this research, and it's been the focus of some of the prior presentations on this series. People who go to church on a weekly basis live longer than those who don't, even after controlling for a host of other possible explanations. As part of this work, I tried to develop more theologically appropriate and sensitive ways to measuring religiousness that attended to the conceptually relevant differences that distinguish the worldviews of Buddhists, Christians, and Muslims. Or more to the point, the relevant differences in worldview that distinguish different streams of Christianity. Differences that have less to do with denominational history than they do with contemporary worldview. But I also worked to develop a theological critique of the existing research on religion and health that presumed to think that you can study God or prayer in precisely the same way that you study aspirin. That seemed problematic on at least two levels. First, it presumes that God is going to play along with your randomized controlled trial. In essence, a good deal of this literature tries to prove God's existence through empirical science. And I worried that if we put all our eggs in that basket, we'd end up with an empty basket, because if it were possible to prove God's existence, smarter people from previous generations would have already done so. My other worry was more substantial. The science of religion and health approached religion like aspirin, as an instrument to be manipulated for the purposes of medicine. Having demonstrated that people who go to church live longer, the temptation was to start prescribing religious attendance as a way to improve health. But there are at least two problems with this approach. First, from an empirical perspective, it is far from certain that people who start going to church in order to live longer will actually accrue the benefit observed in people who have been going to church for reasons intrinsic to the practice of their religion. Motivation, you see, matters. And that brings us to the second problem with this approach. From a theological perspective, we have a word that describes the use of religion to achieve health, and that word is idolatry. To go to church in order to live longer prioritizes long life above God himself. It makes God a tool for achieving merely human desires. And indeed, that is part of the point that I discussed earlier with McKenney's critique of contemporary medicine as an attempt to relieve the human condition. In the end, however, my work in empirical science of religion and health proved too narrow for a career in academic surgery. So I retooled, and from 2007 to 12, I worked on the ethics of informed consent as a way to build a career in the ethics of surgery. I hoped that this would be a broader platform from which I could engage questions of meaning and value. And as many of you know, informed consent is a complicated dance between physician and patient whereby we try to ensure that patients have information sufficient to make decisions that are consistent with their own values. And as a surgeon, I do this on a daily basis before each and every operation. Informed consent is the legal and bureaucratic incarnation of contemporary medical ethics' focus on autonomy. And informed consent has become the kind of dogma that cannot be questioned. But for the reasons cited earlier in my talk that critiques this narrow view, I started to try to point out some of the problems with the dogma of informed consent. For example, the lived practice of informed consent doesn't jibe with the theory. Some patients come with reams of paper printed from the internet ready to make their own decisions. But most patients resist attempts to empower their autonomy. They say, "What are you asking me for, doc? You're the one who went to medical school." Patients are more concerned about building trust sufficient to let me have at them with a sharp instrument when they are incapacitated by anesthesia. And the kind of conversations required to build that kind of trust, I would posit, look very different than the mere disclosure of risks that typically constitute the informed consent discussion. In addition, the focus on autonomy doesn't jibe with my theological formation. Autonomy, beneficence, and justice is not the same gospel as faith, love, and hope. Autonomy is isolated, independent, and respected even by strangers. But love is relational, interdependent, and shared between moral friends. Informed consent seems to me erected to protect patients from hostile physicians in something like Hobbes's state of nature, whereas my lived experience is that most physicians strive to care for patients as moral friends, and the monomaniacal focus on autonomy often gets in the way. Again, don't get me wrong. I'm not advocating for a return to days of doctor knows best. The protections afforded by informed consent are real and important, but they are limited. And I wanted to develop research that exposed some of these limits and worked to a more comprehensive account of the way doctors and patients share decision-making. But this approach also foundered. There just wasn't any funding for research on informed consent, especially research that had the potential to expose limits to such a central doctrine of secular bioethics. Naked emperors, you see, tend to prefer that their subjects avert their eyes from their nakedness. So the idea went into hibernation, and I retooled yet again. This time my focus was more opportunistic. The VA's Chief Research and Development Office put out a call for research on institutional review boards. And as you may know, IRBs are committees charged with evaluating and overseeing human subjects research to ensure that it is ethically designed and compliant with all relevant regulations. I leveraged my past experience to design and implement a program to evaluate and measure the quality and efficiency of 10 IRBs across the network of Veterans Health Administration hospitals. It was challenging and interesting work that leveraged my experience in ethics, and measuring IRB quality was almost as difficult as measuring religiousness. And in this process, I learned new skills in quality improvement methodology. But the work also made me feel a bit like Don Quixote tilting at windmills, because I was essentially trying to improve the quality and efficiency of the federal government, which is never a simple task. And when the Chief Research and Development Officer retired, that funding dried up, and it turned out to be another dead end. So for a fourth time, beginning in 2014, I retooled yet again. This time I chose to focus on a higher stakes decision that I call premature withdrawal of care. Let me describe the situation. Let's say, for example, that you're a World War II veteran seeking my care at the Veteran Hospital. When I look at your x-ray, I can see Iwo Jima shrapnel still lodged in your chest. I also see a new lung cancer. The problem is that you are not a young man. You've had a previous heart attack. You've smoked your whole life and now have emphysema. Your kidneys are not what they once were. I can remove the cancer, but in the process, I'm afraid that there is a strong chance I might push you over the edge. I fear that you'll need a week or more of all that the intensive care unit has all the things that I showed on the first slide in order to get you through the procedure. So I try to talk you out of it. But you, in fact, insist, saying, "Doc, I'm a fighter. I'd rather die trying to cure this thing than to live with the knowledge that it is slowly growing inside me." And because autonomy, beneficence, and justice abide, and because the greatest of these are autonomy, I go ahead and take you to the operating room. And as feared, you end up in the intensive. Before we can really know if you make a recovery, your son flies in from Phoenix, takes one look at you in the ICU and says, "Dad never would have wanted to live like this." So the nurses call the palliative care physicians and they withdraw support, allowing you to die peacefully. But I worried in that sort of circumstance, which happens with some frequency in my hospital, that if we were going to throw in the towel so soon, we should have been able to figure that out before we invested the time, the treasure, and the heartache trying to remove that cancer. And as I networked across the country about this problem, I was introduced to a vascular surgeon in Omaha, Nebraska, who had done some training in geriatrics, where he learned about the concept of frailty. Frailty is exactly what it sounds like. It's the little old lady who struggles to stand up from a chair because she lacks sufficient strength, coordination, or endurance. Frail people have used up most of their physiologic reserve, and as such, the slightest stress, like surgery, can push them over the edge into florid physiological decompensation, which is another way of saying that they need all of the tubes and machines available in that ICU. And not surprisingly, when you operate on frail people, they suffer significantly higher rates of complication, death, and disability. And perhaps more worrisome is the fact that they may lose their independence and become institutionalized, permanently dependent on others for their basic needs. My colleague took this idea of frailty and ran with it. He put together a rough and ready way to measure frailty, and then he required that score as a precondition for scheduling surgery at the Omaha VA hospital. If the score exceeded a specific threshold, he reviewed the patient's chart and made some calls. He made sure that the operating surgeon understood the risks. He made sure that the anesthesiologists were ready to manage the frail patient in particular ways. And he aggressively referred patients to palliative care physicians before the operation to make sure that everybody was on the same page regarding realistic expectations and goals. And after initiating this program, the postoperative mortality rate at that Omaha Veterans Hospital dropped dramatically. But my colleague didn't have the research experience to crunch the numbers in a way that could get published, but I did. And together we demonstrated that his simple intervention cut the 180-day postoperative mortality rate of frail patients from 24% to less than 8%, corresponding to a threefold survival advantage in controlled models. That is huge, almost too good to be true. But I think it is true because we controlled for just about everything, and the results have held up as we have replicated it across almost 100 hospitals throughout the world. After our initial experience, we put together a fantastic grant proposal aimed at replicating the findings under stringent randomized conditions at 3 other veteran medical centers. The internal review of the grant proposal raised methodological concerns, so we revised and resubmitted. But again, that grant proposal and my work found it. The proposal was not funded, and I was back to the drawing board. The setback was so significant that I was beginning to question if the whole bivocational research career was really what I was supposed to be doing. Perhaps it was a big mistake. But then God happened. For reasons that I can't really explain, somebody from UPMC heard about my work and asked me to give a 5-minute presentation about frailty at the next PCC meeting on the 11th floor of the big tower in our city. I asked who would be attending, and when I learned it would be most of the department chairs from UPMC, I said to myself, well, I guess I should wear a suit. And on 2 days' notice, I showed up and gave them 5 minutes on frailty. They asked questions, lots of excited, interested questions. I kept answering questions as all the other agenda items for that meeting fell aside, and after an hour, the guy at the far end of the giant boardroom table called the meeting to a close by saying, well, I think we can all agree that this has been the most interesting discussion we've had in recent memory, and I'm sure we'll be looking into how we can do something about this at our hospitals. I left the boardroom at 6 p.m., and by 6 a.m. the following morning, I had emails from the top 3 executives at UPMC, and by 7 a.m., one of them had called me to make sure that I understood that they wanted to hire me as a consultant. Welcome aboard. So I started working, and I leveraged my experience with IRB quality improvement to work with the quality improvement team at UPMC. And as of July of 2016, the productivity bonus of every surgeon across our 22 hospitals has been linked to whether or not they measure frailty with the tool that I had helped develop and validate. And by 2017, frailty had been assessed in over 50,000 pre-surgical patients at UPMC, and similar programs were being initiated at veterans hospitals in Pittsburgh, Atlanta, Nashville, Phoenix, Houston, and San Antonio. And all of this caught the attention of local and national media, landing on the front page above the fold. And in the subsequent years, the approach has been replicated at more than 100 hospitals across the world, earning the endorsement of the Joint Commission and the National Quality Forum. The point of frailty screening is to identify patients at particularly high risk for disability, institutionalization, and death, so that we can all make sure that the decision-making is solid. We call this the surgical pause. I, as a surgeon, have a great hammer. You might look like a nail that needs to be driven home, But the surgical pause makes everyone take a step back and say, well, Mr. Jones, you certainly look like a nail, but by virtue of your frailty, you're at high risk. You'll probably need a little help from the ICU, but we can probably make you through. We've got an opening on March 7th, but tell me, is there anything on your bucket list coming up in the next couple of months? And Mr. Jones says to me, yes, my granddaughter is getting married in May. Her father died in a car crash 2 years ago, and I'm supposed to walk her down the aisle. Now that, my friends, is a thick description of what it means for Mr. Jones to flourish. And there's no way that we're going to be operating on that patient before the wedding. You see, the practice of medicine requires choosing the best option from among multiple imperfect options. Aristotle, as you know, called this particular virtue of good judgment phronesis, translating into the Latin as prudence. And although the best option will certainly respect patient autonomy, and it will also be beneficent and just, but although these principles are necessary, they are not sufficient. Choosing the best option requires knowing the goal, the telos, toward which medical technology should be directed. And the goal of good medicine is to help patients flourish in all the thickness that that word entails. It requires knowing what human beings and their bodies are for. And although there are a variety of answers to that question, Christians confess that the definitive self-revelation of God's intention for the human body was made through the life and witness of his Son, Jesus, and through the ongoing revelation of the Holy Spirit through the mystical, broken, and divided body of Christ that is the Church. And even though the surgical pause does not explicitly appeal to Christian theology, it asks questions that restore focus on a more fulsome metaphysic that helps physicians and patients alike discern for what purpose they are pursuing health and healing. And if people engage these questions seriously, I believe that God will make himself known. And through this process, I hope I am doing something to integrate my two vocations as surgeon and priest between altar and table. When I was a child, my favorite Christmas carol was The Little Drummer Boy. I don't know whether you have that in Greek, but it's about a little boy that had no gift to give the Christ child, but who nonetheless gave the gift that he had, which was beating out his own rhythm on a drum that he hoped the Lord would love. I love that song so much that it was the inspiration for this, the first Christmas ornament that I ever made to put on our tree. And crude as it is, my mother would place it next to the wise men in the Christmas creche over the mantel of our fireplace. And the theme continued throughout childhood with a number of other ornaments like this. I now find the song a bit saccharine, but nonetheless, it seems to me that I've spent 56 years beating out a rhythm that I thought was both beautiful and faithful. And for many years, I felt isolated, and nobody seemed to appreciate my music. But by God's providence, in a way that I could never have imagined, let alone planned, I am now seated at the table with policymakers across the country in a position to make real and lasting improvements to the way that hospitals and surgeons care for the most frail and vulnerable people among us. Miracles, my friends, do happen. They happen when people like me and people like you have the courage and faith to march to the drummer from Nazareth. And let the people say, Amen. Thank you all very much, and I'd be pleased to take any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hall, for this impressive presentation. And I rush to ask you, trying to translate some of the questions we have. So, number one, the percentage of faithful physicians, mostly surgeons, is higher than the average percentage of Americans according to studies. Why there are no more ordained physician surgeons than the ones you mentioned before?
I'm not sure of that answer. It's a hard thing to do both. It's a lot of extra training, I think, and it's still, although the prevalence of Christianity may be higher, the way in which it's lived out and worked out is different. Also, in the United States, And in my excuse me, I found that the prevalence of bivocational ministry was much more prevalent among Christian denominations and traditions that call their clergy priest rather than minister, pastor, or preacher, a more functional definition. If there's an ontological understanding of what it means to be ordained sacramentally, then one can envision being a priest while doing something that is not directly related to the sacramental life of the church. And there are a lot of Baptists and evangelicals that don't have this quite the same sacramental understanding that is prevalent in the Orthodox, Roman Catholic, Lutheran, and Episcopal churches, where most of the ordained clergy I found. So that would perhaps explain some of it.
Another question that's kind of following what you just answered, that if the main service of an ordained priest, especially in the Orthodox faith, is to offer the Eucharist, do you think a degree in theology, this extra training that you mentioned, is obligatory for a physician, a surgeon, to become an ordained priest?
That's a great question. What I know from my own experience is that I was shaped and transformed by my own theological education. There is no way that I think I could faithfully administer the sacraments without having some deeply lived understanding of what I'm participating in there. And without that kind of robust theological training that includes both a cognitive aspect, but as well a practitioner development of a prayer life and a set of disciplines to guard one's life that can't really be accomplished just by training you how to say the right words and have the appropriate manual acts over the altar. I think that kind of training really is necessary to keep things headed in the right direction. I grieve at the ways in which the body of Christ has been broken by people going in their own directions, starting with the Great Schism in the 12th century between East and West, and proliferating after that in all sorts of different ways. And I think that part of that has to do with that we don't shape people intrinsically within communities of practice that can hold each other accountability. So I think that accountability would probably be the main reason why I think there needs to be something around that kind of training. Whether you have to go deep into the theology, I'm not sure. There may be able to right-size something, but something like that needs to occur.
Thank you very much. Practical question. Is the website for ordained physicians you showed us active? And also, is there any association of ordained physicians in the States?
I attempted through that website to try to establish something along those lines. It was beyond my capacity in the middle of training to do that. And now I'm super busy, and whether I'll at some point be able to return to it and try to make that happen, there is not. There is a Society of Ordained Scientists led out of Britain, in which I know there are a number of physicians who participate. And I think, as you know, Demetrius, there is the program on medicine and religion and the conference on medicine and religion that has gathered together an interdisciplinary community that is interested in theology and medicine, and that fills in many ways that kind of role, but it's not exclusively limited to those who are ordained clergy. The website, as far as I know, is still up and running, and you can get access to the full dissertation report if you're interested in looking at it, but it hasn't had any maintenance for over a decade.
Thank you. What do you think about the need for obtaining a spiritual history from each patient? Do you obtain a spiritual history in addition to the usual medical history?
I think that it is important. It depends a little bit on the context of what's going on. as to when it is that I might do that. I practice in a largely supervisory role where I am attempting to let my trainees present themselves as the physician. It's the VA hospital is one of the few places that they can practice with some independence. So I basically try to keep them safe and don't try to control what is happening. But when I am called, and I am often called for these more challenging conversations, when there needs to be a goal clarification or a shift in the goals of care or a particularly difficult decision among a frail person where things have not gone as well. And I do routinely begin to ask questions about their sources of meaning and value, and will include a faith history in that context. I think it is something that can become routinized. But it can be a little bit uncomfortable in the same way that I remember in medical school that we had to be taught and to rehearse and practice asking, do you have sex with men, women, or both? Which was just a crazy thing to say as a layperson, at least in the early 1990s, to be able to sort of say, tell me about your faith background. Is it important to you, and would you like me to address it in some way, shape, or form? That takes some practice.
Thank you. The last two questions. We hear about the microbiome, the holobiome, and the new understanding of the human cells and genes in symbiosis with trillions of microbes. What do you think about this new understanding from the theological standpoint?
It's fascinating. I haven't done a whole lot of reading about the microbiome, but I think it does speak to some of the points that I was making and quoting Wendell Berry about, that the idea of isolating health as an individual organism separate from all of the goodness of God's great earth, that we are just beginning to scratch the surface of understanding the ways in which it is interdependent with each other, with everything else that is there, and the way that we intervene to create both health and disease, and that has ripple effects far beyond what's going on. So I think that we have actually some insight with the microbiome of some of the mechanistic ways in which this occurs. And beyond the mechanistic, I think that the communities in which we live and move and have our being are also ordered and disordered in different ways, and much of what modernity has done to isolate ourselves from each other. Maybe a different context in Greece than it is in the United States, but the churches and the neighborhoods are no longer functioning in the way that they even did when I was a young child, and leads to I think that this is related to these deaths of despair and the growing substance abuse and issues, the way in which we medicate ourselves with eating too much, and there's just a whole host of problems that I think are rooted in the way in which we don't recognize and embrace our interdependence, and instead pursue our independence, like good libertarians, wanting everybody else to just leave us alone.
Yeah. And the last question is, what is your opinion on supported euthanasia?
My ordination to the diaconate was delayed for a year because my canonical exams for ethics focused on physician-assisted suicide, where I maintained the position that although I understood those that were making an argument in favor of it, I thought that I stood on good theological and scriptural grounds to suggest that the wages of sin are death, and that our hope is in the resurrection, and that any embrace of that would be contrary to the Christian witness. And my response was determined to be insufficiently pastoral to the examining chaplains, which seemed to be the wrong power dynamic between the examining chaplains and me. And they remediated me by going and putting me into a smaller, a more rural environment to be able to learn how to talk with people that weren't Ivy League educated physicians, and that was a good experience. But I continue to maintain a position that this is a colossally bad idea. And that there, I mean, quite independent from Christian theological perspectives, there are good anthropological reasons why you want to make crystal clear that when you go to a doctor, the one thing that they are absolutely not going to do is kill you, at least on purpose, or assist you in that way. I also think that the motivation that is driving the desire or the market for physician-assisted suicide is an indictment both of the church and the medical profession in abandoning people who cannot be cured. And that the appropriate response is to gather around them, to embed them within a community, to attend and compassion, to suffer with them in their transitus, to treat their pain as much as possible, which is often, and again, I would be liberal with the principle of double effect in using narcotics liberally, so far as my aim and goal is to alleviate their suffering as they are in agonal breathing and in the end of their life. But the idea of presenting because you just find life not worth living at the moment and having a physician prescribe for you a lethal dose of medication, I think that that's a colossally bad idea.
Thank you, Professor Hall, for your time and this wonderful talk. We all enjoyed. We are grateful to you. Have a nice day. Thank you so much.